Winter, 1285. The Carpathian Mountains. A sentry named Istvan stands watch on the stone battlements of Sarospadak Fortress, his gloved hands gripping the frost-covered parapet. He's 30 years old, born 3 years after the terror his parents survived. His mother still wakes screaming some nights, calling out names of siblings he never met. His father carries burn scars across his back from a village that no longer exists. Istvan breathes into his hands, watching the vapor disappear into the frozen darkness. Then he feels it before he hears it. A vibration through the stone. A tremor in the earth itself. The sound reaches him next, distant at first, then growing. The drumbeat of hooves against frozen ground. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. And then the war cry splits the winter night. That same chant his parents described in whispered horror stories. You and I, you and I, you and I. Istvan's hand moves to the warning bell, but he doesn't ring it yet. He's staring into the darkness, watching torches appear along the mountain passes like scattered stars descending to earth. The Mongols. The empire that burned the world. The nightmare that depopulated his homeland before he was born. They've come back. Around him, other guards freeze. Some of them remember. Old Petr, who was 7 when he watched his village burn. Young Laszlo's grandfather, who survived by hiding in a cave for 3 weeks. They all know the stories. A quarter of Hungary's population dead. Cities reduced to ash. Wolves reclaiming farmland because there was nobody left to plant crops. The stories say the Mongols are unstoppable. They say resistance is pointless. They say when the thunder of Mongol hooves reaches your ears, your death has already been written. But here's the thing. This time, the stories are wrong. What happened in 1285 wasn't a repeat of 1241. It wasn't even close. It was, in fact, the exact opposite. It was the moment when the most successful military machine in human history slammed face first into a wall they couldn't break. A wall that Hungary had spent 44 years building specifically to destroy them. This is the story of how a kingdom learned from catastrophic failure. How they transformed themselves so completely that their enemies didn't recognize them. How they turned strategic patience and long-term vision into a weapon more powerful than any cavalry charge. And it's the story of how the Mongol Empire, which had conquered everything from Korea to Poland, finally met an opponent they couldn't defeat. But to understand how Hungary crushed the Mongols, we need to understand how badly they lost the first time. We need to go back to April 1241, to a riverside plain called Mohi, to witness what one chronicler called the day Hungary died. King Bela IV wasn't an idiot. I want to be very clear about that because it's easy to look at what happened and assume incompetence. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't a coward. By 13th century standards, Bela was a capable, intelligent ruler who'd strengthened royal authority and maintained one of Central Europe's most powerful kingdoms. When reports reached him in 1237 about a mysterious Eastern army destroying everything in its path, he took them seriously, sort of. A Dominican friar named Julianus arrived at Bela's court with a letter from Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself. The letter was simple. Surrender your entire kingdom unconditionally or be destroyed. Bela did what most medieval kings would do when confronted with an outrageous ultimatum from an unknown power thousands of miles away. He laughed it off. You can't really blame him. Imagine some messenger showing up at your door, claiming to represent an empire you've never heard of, demanding you hand over everything you own. You'd probably tell them to get lost too. The second warning came in 1239. The Cumans, a nomadic people, fled into Hungary with tales that sounded like fever dreams. Cities erased in days. Populations massacred down to the last child. An army that moved faster than warning riders could carry news of their approach. Bela granted them refuge and settled them in the Tisa River plains. The third warning came in early 1241 from Poland, which was already burning. By then, it was too late to prepare properly. You see, Bela faced a problem that would seem absurd to modern military minds. But it was brutally real in medieval Europe. For generations, Hungarian kings had maintained absolute monopoly on castle construction. Only the king could authorize stone fortifications, and those were built primarily along the western border facing the Holy Roman Empire. Why? because powerful castles meant powerful nobles, and powerful nobles meant challenges to royal authority. The policy had worked brilliantly for maintaining centralized control, but it was about to get hundreds of thousands of people killed. When the Mongols crossed into Hungary in March 1241, there were almost no fortifications to stop them, no walls to shelter behind, no strongholds to anchor a defense. The Mongol invasion didn't come as a single massive army. It came as 5 separate forces, each one a masterpiece of coordinated strategy. The main army, perhaps 60,000 strong, came through the Vereke Pass under Batu Khan and the legendary general Subutai. The speed of the advance was terrifying. They moved faster than messengers, faster than defending armies could mobilize. How? Each Mongol warrior had multiple horses, rotating mounts constantly, maintaining a pace that would kill European war horses within days. Bela had personally supervised construction of dense barriers along Hungary's eastern frontier, months of labor, significant expense. The Mongols had specialized engineer units that cleared the obstacles in 3 days. Hungarian forces scattered across the kingdom tried to intercept them. Every single attempt failed catastrophically. Archbishop Ugrinsak led an army against a Mongol contingent. The Mongols feigned retreat. The archbishop, thinking he'd won a glorious victory, ordered his heavy cavalry to pursue. The Mongols led them straight into marshland. Hungarian horses sank into the mud. Mongol horse archers circled the trapped forces and shot them to pieces from safe distance. By the time Bela gathered his main army, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, his kingdom was already bleeding from 1,000 cuts. On April 10, 1241, the 2 main forces confronted each other at the Sejo River near the town of Mohi. For once, the Hungarians had numerical superiority. They occupied the advantageous western bank. They controlled the only significant bridge. When a small Mongol force tried to cross that night, Hungarian crossbowmen drove them back with heavy casualties. The Hungarian camp erupted in celebration. They defeated the terrifying Mongols. Wine flowed. Men toasted their courage. If you know anything about military history, you can probably guess what happened next. The bridge assault wasn't a defeat for the Mongols. It was theater, carefully choreographed deception designed to make the Hungarians feel safe, to make them drop their guard. While the Hungarians celebrated their victory, Subutai was calmly executing a plan he'd probably conceived days earlier. At dawn on April 11th, Batu Khan launched another assault across the bridge. This time with something new. Catapults hurling projectiles that contemporary accounts describe as thunder and fire, some kind of explosive or incendiary that created noise, smoke, and absolute terror among defenders. But that frontal assault was just a distraction. While Hungarians focused all attention on the bridge, Subutai had found a ford several miles upstream. During the night, while the Hungarians slept off their celebration, Subutai's forces had quietly moved into position. Now, as Batu attacked from the front, Subutai's cavalry swept around to attack the Hungarian camp from behind. The Hungarians, realizing they were about to be surrounded, did exactly what the Mongols wanted. They charged out of their camp in a desperate attempt to break through before the encirclement closed. And that's when the trap snapped shut. Here's where Hungarian mistakes came back to haunt them. The camp had been poorly organized, tents crammed together with no room to maneuver, wagons arranged in a defensive perimeter which seemed smart, until it became a prison, trapping thousands of soldiers in a confined space with nowhere to run. Mongol archers, the finest in the world, launched volley after volley into the packed mass of humanity. When the Hungarians finally broke free and tried to flee westward, they found something that looked like a miracle, a gap in the Mongol encirclement, an escape route. Thousands of men poured through that gap, abandoning formations, throwing down weapons. This wasn't mercy. This was tactical genius based on psychological insight that Sun Tzu had written about centuries earlier. Give your enemy a golden bridge to retreat across. The Mongols understood that trapped men fight with desperate courage. But men given an escape route will take it, and running men are easy to kill. As the Hungarian army dissolved into panic retreat, Mongol-like cavalry pursued them for miles. Methodically, systematically, they'd ride up behind fleeing soldiers, shoot them with arrows, and move to the next target. It was slaughter conducted with industrial efficiency. By nightfall on April 11th, somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 Hungarian soldiers were dead. In a single day, Hungary lost more troops than most medieval kingdoms could field in total. Archbishop Ugrin Sak died in the massacre. Duke Koloman of Slavonia, Bella's own brother, was mortally wounded. King Bela himself barely escaped, riding desperately toward Austria with Mongol pursuit units hunting him across his own kingdom like a wounded animal, and the Mongols had barely started their real work. What followed was a year Hungarians would remember simply as the devastation. The Mongol army, freed from meaningful military opposition, spread across Hungary like a plague. They burned Pest, the major city on the Danube's eastern bank. They swept across the great Hungarian plain, destroying everything with systematic thoroughness. This wasn't just military destruction. The Mongols demolished civilian infrastructure with the same efficiency they applied to military targets. Villages burned, farms razed, monasteries sacked, mills demolished, bridges destroyed. They killed livestock, destroyed crops, poisoned wells. The death toll was staggering. Modern historians estimate approximately 25% of Hungary's population died, between 250,000 and 500,000 people. Some regions were almost completely depopulated. Contemporary chroniclers described wolves and wild animals reclaiming villages because there were simply no humans left alive. But here's what's interesting: the detail that would prove crucial 44 years later. Not every fortification fell. When the Mongols attacked Esztergom, the capital and largest city, they brought 30 siege engines, 30 catapults and trebuchets, the kind of artillery that had reduced mighty Chinese and Persian cities to rubble. They bombarded the stone walls with everything in their arsenal. The walls stood firm, thick enough, and well-built enough to absorb the impacts without significant damage. When bombardment failed, the Mongols tried assault. Batu Khan himself personally led a desperate attack on the walls. He lost 30 of his personal bodyguards, elite Batar warriors. Crossbowmen cut them down from the battlements. The Mongols, masters of siege warfare who had cracked fortresses across Asia, couldn't take a single well-built stone castle in Hungary. The Croatian fortress of Klis held as well. The Mongols hurled stones at the walls. The stones bounced off. After several days of futile assault, they gave up and moved on. These successes were tiny bright spots in an ocean of darkness, but they were bright spots nonetheless. And someone was paying attention. Someone was learning the lesson that stone walls, properly built and properly defended, could stop the Mongols cold. In March 1242, as suddenly as they'd come, the Mongols left. Word had reached Batu Khan that great Khan Ogedei had died back in Mongolia. Mongol succession law required all princes of the blood to return for the Kurultai, the assembly that would elect a new Khan. Batu withdrew his forces eastward, leaving behind a kingdom so devastated it would take generations to fully recover. King Bela IV returned from his refuge on the Adriatic coast to find his realm in ruins. Contemporary accounts describe him weeping openly at the sight of his destroyed capital. Bela could have despaired. He could have focused solely on immediate recovery, on rebuilding what was lost. Many kings would have done exactly that. But Bela IV was about to prove himself one of the most remarkable rulers in Hungarian history, because as he surveyed the smoking ruins of his kingdom, he wasn't just thinking about recovery. He was thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the next invasion, because he knew with absolute certainty the Mongols would return. And when they did, Hungary would be ready, not just ready to resist, ready to win. Before we continue with how Bela transformed Hungary, if you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval military strategy, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this content to more history enthusiasts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that subscribe button because we've got more stories like this coming. Imagine standing where Bela stood in summer 1242. Your capital is ash and rubble. Bodies are still being collected from ditches. Your treasury is empty. Your nobles are scattered. Your military has been annihilated. You have a traumatized population questioning whether God himself has abandoned them. Most kings faced with this situation would spend their entire reign just trying to get back to where they were before. Bela decided to build something that had never existed before. The lesson of Esztergom and Klis was obvious once you saw it. Stone walls stopped the Mongols, not wooden palisades, not earthwork fortifications, not faith or courage or cavalry charges. Stone. But Hungary had barely any stone castles. maybe a dozen significant ones in the entire kingdom. And building more was incredibly expensive. Bela did something that must have seemed insane to his contemporaries. He reversed centuries of Hungarian royal policy. In a series of decrees starting in 1242 and continuing throughout his reign, he actively encouraged nobles to build stone castles, not just permitted, encouraged. He offered incentives, tax breaks, political privileges to anyone who would construct proper defensive works. Think about what this meant politically. For generations, Hungarian kings had jealously guarded their monopoly on military power. They understood that strong castles meant strong nobles, and strong nobles meant threats to royal authority. Bela was deliberately creating potential rivals to his own power because he understood something more fundamental. A king who rules over ashes rules over nothing. Better to share power with strong nobles who can defend the kingdom than maintain absolute authority over a graveyard. Better to risk future civil conflict than guarantee present extinction. The transformation was staggering. In the first 10 years after the invasion, 44 new stone castles appeared across Hungary. By the end of Bela's reign in 1270, that number had nearly tripled to around 100 castles. Think about that. More castles built in a single generation than many European kingdoms built in centuries. And these weren't just any fortifications. These were state-of-the-art defensive works incorporating every lesson learned from the Mongol invasion, built on hilltops, on river bluffs, on any terrain that gave natural advantages. They had thick walls, often 8 to 10 feet thick, designed to withstand bombardment, multiple defensive layers, provisions for long sieges. Take Visegrad, built between 1246 and 1259 on a commanding hilltop above the Danube bend. Bela financed it using his wife Queen Maria's dowry. The king literally used his wife's marriage settlement to build this fortress. That's how seriously he took the threat. The fortress controlled river passage through the mountains, making it impossible for any army to move along the Danube without dealing with Visegrad first. Or consider Buda Castle. Before 1241, Hungary's capital had been Esztergom. After the invasion, Bela moved the seat of power to Buda, specifically because of its superior defensive position on Castle Hill overlooking the Danube. The new capital wasn't just rebuilt. It was reimagined as a fortress city that could serve as a final redoubt if the Mongols returned. But Bela didn't stop with castles. He completely reformed the Hungarian military structure. The light cavalry that had formed the bulk of Hungarian forces before 1241 had proven worse than useless against the Mongols, who were simply better at their own game. Bela shifted resources toward heavy cavalry, toward armored knights who could hold ground and fight in close quarters. He recruited crossbowmen from Venice and other Italian city-states. He brought in the Knights Hospitaller and other military orders. These weren't just soldiers. They were military professionals who brought generations of accumulated tactical knowledge. The social engineering was equally radical. Vast stretches of Hungary had been depopulated. Dead farmers don't pay taxes. Empty land produces nothing. Bela launched an aggressive campaign to repopulate his kingdom, offering incentives to Germans, Poles, Italians, settlers from across Europe. Thousands came. They brought new agricultural techniques, new trades and skills. They established towns and villages on land that had been reduced to wilderness. Within a generation, many of the worst-hit areas had recovered their populations and productivity. Bela promoted mining and metallurgy, understanding that economic strength was the foundation of military power. He encouraged development of fortified towns, granting urban privileges to settlements that agreed to maintain walls and militia forces. He was creating defense in depth, a network of mutually supporting strongpoints that would make any invader's life miserable. And all the while, throughout these decades of transformation, frontier raids from the east reminded everyone this wasn't theoretical. The Mongols hadn't forgotten about Hungary. Small raiding parties would cross the borders, probe defenses, test the new fortifications. They were watching, learning, waiting. Bela's transformation program came with costs. By granting nobles the right to build castles and maintain private armies, he was sowing seeds of future civil conflict. Those fortified nobles became increasingly independent, increasingly willing to challenge royal authority. But Bela knew what he was doing. He was making a calculated trade-off, sacrificing absolute centralized authority for something more valuable in the immediate term: survival. When Bela IV died in 1270 after a reign of 35 years, he left behind a kingdom utterly transformed. Chroniclers would call him the second founder of Hungary, ranking him alongside King Stephen I, who had originally established the Hungarian state in the year 1000. It's a deserved title. In many ways, what Bela created in the decades after 1241 was more remarkable than the original foundation. His son Stephen V ruled for only 2 years before dying in 1272. The throne then passed to Bela's grandson, Ladislaus IV. Ladislaus was 10 years old when he became king. His mother was Cuman, one of those nomadic refugees who'd fled the Mongols decades earlier. As Ladislaus grew up, he increasingly identified with his Cuman heritage rather than Hungarian Christian court culture. He dressed like the Cumans, lived among them, even took Cuman mistresses while neglecting his Christian wife. The Hungarian nobility and church hierarchy were appalled. The Archbishop of Esztergom declared what amounted to a crusade against his own king. By the 1280s, Hungary was in barely controlled chaos. Ladislaus was feuding with the church. Nobles were fighting each other over territory and privilege, using those castles Bela had encouraged them to build as bases for private warfare. In 1282, the Cumans themselves rebelled. Ladislaus crushed them at Lake Hode, proving he could be an effective military commander when necessary. But his relationship with both church and nobility remained poisonous. To external observers, Hungary looked weak, divided, on the verge of collapse. It looked like exactly the kind of target the Mongols had built their empire, conquering. And that's when the Mongols decided it was time for round 2. The Mongol Empire of 1285 wasn't the unified juggernaut Genghis Khan had built. After succession struggles, the empire had fragmented into 4 major khanates. The Golden Horde, which controlled the western steppes and Russia, was effectively autonomous under its own leadership. In 1285, the real power in the Golden Horde was a man named Nogai. And Nogai was every bit as formidable and ambitious as his famous predecessors. He'd spent decades consolidating influence through military success and political maneuvering. He'd conducted campaigns from the Balkans to the Caucasus. He'd defeated Byzantine armies. He'd established himself as a kingmaker in Eastern European politics. And he had big ambitions. He looked at fractured Hungary, racked by internal conflict, and saw opportunity, a chance to complete the conquest Batu Khan had begun, to sweep across Central Europe, to cement his legacy as a conqueror worthy of Genghis himself. The immediate trigger was almost absurdly convenient. After Ladislaus crushed the Cuman rebellion in 1282, many Cuman warriors fled eastward rather than submit to forced Christianization. They crossed into Golden Horde territory, where they found employment with Nogai's forces. These refugees told Nogai everything about Hungary's internal weaknesses, about the young king despised by his own nobles and excommunicated by his own church. They painted a picture of a realm ripe for conquest. Nogai made his decision. He would finish what Batu Khan had started 44 years earlier. In late 1285, as winter began gripping Eastern Europe with unusual ferocity, 2 massive Mongol armies crossed into Hungarian territory. The northern force, led by a prince named Talabuga, came through the Carpathian passes following roughly the same route Batu had taken. The southern force, under Nogai himself, swept through Transylvania. The Mongol plan was elegant in its simplicity. The 2 armies would ravage the countryside, draw out Hungarian forces, defeat them through superior mobility, then converge on Pest and crush any remaining resistance. They expected this campaign to go like the 1241 invasion, maybe even faster. What Nogai and Talabuga didn't understand was that they weren't invading the Hungary of 1241. They were invading something fundamentally new, something that had been designed and built specifically to kill Mongols. The Hungarian response confused the Mongol commanders from the very beginning. King Ladislaus IV did assemble a royal army, but it didn't mass at a single location waiting for decisive battle. Instead, Hungarian forces remained dispersed. Local magnates mobilized their own armies and garrisoned their own castles. Rather than seeking a grand confrontation like Mohi, the Hungarians seemed content to let the Mongols come to them. Talabuga's northern army was first to discover what this meant in practice. As they penetrated deeper into Hungary, they found that every significant town was protected by stone fortifications. Every strategic point had a castle. The fortress at Rechk, perched on a hilltop in northeastern Hungary, refused to yield. The Mongols brought up their siege equipment. They hurled stones at the walls. The walls stood firm, built by people who understood siege warfare, designed specifically to withstand bombardment. While the Mongols focused on sieges going nowhere, Hungarian forces harassed them constantly. Local commanders like Baron Roland Borsa, Amadeus Abba, and Peter of Saros, Shachrosh, led mobile forces that attacked Mongol foraging parties, ambushed isolated detachments, struck at supply lines, then retreated to their fortified bases before the Mongols could retaliate. It was guerrilla warfare conducted by forces that had safe havens to retreat to. The Seke people, fierce Hungarian allied warriors who lived in the Carpathian borderlands, proved especially effective. They knew the terrain intimately, every valley and pass, every forest path and river ford. They used the mountains the way a skilled fighter uses terrain in combat, turning natural features into weapons against invaders. The Teresko fortress in Transylvania became a particular thorn in Talabuga's side. Defended by Sakely warriors, it withstood multiple assaults. The Mongols would attack, lose men to arrows and rockfalls, fail to make progress, withdraw. Each assault was a failure. Each failure a drain on morale and resources. Meanwhile, winter was setting in with unusual severity. Snow, ice, freezing temperatures. The Mongols had deliberately invaded in winter, expecting frozen rivers and hard ground would help their mobility, but they'd failed to account for what winter would mean in a campaign of sieges against prepared defenses. Here's what the Mongols hadn't considered. Their greatest strength was mobility. Their entire military system was built around fast-moving cavalry that could cover massive distances and concentrate overwhelming force against isolated targets. But Hungary in winter, filled with fortified strong points that couldn't be quickly bypassed or reduced, negated that advantage entirely. The Mongols found themselves bogged down in siege operations they weren't equipped to win, burning through supplies while accomplishing nothing. Their mobility, their greatest asset, became irrelevant when there was nowhere productive to maneuver to. And the weather that winter was particularly brutal. Deep snow made movement difficult even for their hardy steppe ponies. Frozen ground meant horses couldn't graze as easily, requiring them to carry more fodder or requisition it from a countryside that had been thoroughly stripped of supplies. Nogai's southern army in Transylvania faced similar frustrations. They managed to capture exactly one significant fortification, the castle at Bon Mikod. That success cost them dearly. Everywhere else, stone walls and determined defenders stopped them cold. Local forces under Voivode Roland Borsa conducted a masterful defensive campaign using mountainous terrain to channel Mongol movements into killing zones and set up devastating ambushes. Borsa had studied accounts of the 1241 invasion. He understood how the Mongols fought, so he simply didn't engage on their terms. He harassed, ambushed, retreated, repeated. The Hungarian militia forces deserve special mention. These weren't professional soldiers. They were armed peasants, townsmen, and minor gentry, organized and trained specifically for local defense. They knew their own regions intimately. They fought with the desperation of people defending homes and families. More importantly, they had strong points to fall back to when pressed. It was a defensive system incredibly difficult to defeat because there was no single point of failure. By early 1286, probably around February, Talabuga and Nogai managed to link up their forces outside Pest. If they'd succeeded in taking the city, that might have salvaged the campaign. But Pest was now fortified with stone walls, defended by troops who knew exactly what Mongol victory looked like. The city didn't fall, the walls held. The Mongol commanders had a decision to make. They could continue the campaign, besieging fortresses they couldn't crack, bleeding men and horses to constant harassment, or they could cut their losses and withdraw. They chose withdrawal. It was the rational choice, but also an admission of failure. The retreat, especially Talabuga's northern route back through the Carpathians, turned into a nightmare. The same mountain passes that had funneled the Mongols into Hungary now became killing grounds. Hungarian forces struck from ambush and disappeared into the mountains. Winter storms caught armies strung out along mountain roads. The careful discipline that had characterized the advance dissolved into something approaching panic. The Vereki Pass, the same pass Batu Khan had used triumphantly in 1241, became Talabuga's Valley of Death. Contemporary sources describe his army being shredded by constant attacks. Hungarian forces picking off stragglers and supply trains. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a catastrophe. Nogai's retreat was better organized, but he too faced constant harassment and heavy losses. King Ladislas IV, who had carefully avoided committing his main army to decisive battle during the invasion, now pursued the retreating Mongols, making their withdrawal as costly as possible. The entire invasion lasted about 2 months, 2 months compared to the year-long devastation of 1241. Some regions suffered raids, but the heartland was untouched. No major cities had fallen. The network of castles had held. The network of castles had held. The population hadn't been massacred. The Mongols had been stopped. For the first time in their westward expansion, for the first time since they'd begun their conquest of the world under Genghis Khan, the Mongols had failed to achieve their objectives and been forced to retreat without accomplishing anything significant. The military force that had conquered the largest land empire in human history had just been defeated by a kingdom they'd almost wiped out 44 years earlier. The consequences rippled far beyond Hungary's borders. Within the Golden Horde itself, the failure triggered a political earthquake. Talabuga blamed Nogai for the disaster. In 1287, just 2 years after the Hungarian debacle, Talabuga orchestrated a coup and seized power. His relationship with Nogai became openly hostile. The Golden Horde descended into internal conflict that weakened it for years. In 1287, less than 2 years after the Hungarian failure, the Mongols tried again. This time, invading Poland. They failed again, running into the same problems. The Poles had learned the same lessons the Hungarians had. A Hungarian force under György of Sovar, Shuhr, even participated in Polish defense, sharing experience and expertise. After these back-to-back failures in 1285 to 1287, the Golden Horde never again mounted a major invasion of Central Europe. Raids and border skirmishes continued for decades, but the dream of conquering Europe, of riding all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, had died in the snows of the Carpathian Mountains and outside the walls of Hungarian stone castles. By the 14th century, the tables had completely turned. In 1345, a Hungarian army under Count Andrew Lakfy, Lot Sk. Fee, actually invaded Golden Horde territory, defeated a Mongol force in open battle, and captured the region that would become Moldavia. The hunters had become the hunted. The victims had become victors. Let's step back and think about what actually happened here from a strategic perspective, because the Hungarian victory in 1285 offers lessons that remain relevant even today. First, the value of preparation and long-term strategic thinking. Bela IV didn't just react to the Mongol invasion with short-term fixes. He anticipated the next invasion and spent nearly 3 decades preparing systematically. That's extraordinary strategic patience. Most leaders focus on immediate crises. Bela looked 40 years into the future and made decisions that would only pay off after his death. Second, the importance of learning from defeat. The 1241 invasion was a catastrophe, but it was also an education. The Hungarians learned that light cavalry was useless against Mongol horse archers. They learned wooden fortifications were useless. They learned that trying to mass forces for single decisive battles was suicide. But they also learned what worked. Stone castles worked. Crossbowmen fighting from defensive positions worked. Dispersed resistance worked. Defense in depth worked. The Hungarians didn't just rebuild what they'd lost. They rebuilt smarter. The Mongols, conversely, didn't learn, didn't adapt. They returned to Hungary in 1285 with essentially the same tactical approach that had worked in 1241, assuming it would work again. They failed to recognize that their enemy had fundamentally transformed. Third, the power of defensive technology. We tend to focus on offensive military innovations because they're more dramatic, but defensive technology often actually determines outcomes. The Mongols conquered most of Eurasia, with tactics developed on the open steppe. Those tactics were devastatingly effective against enemies who fought the same way in open field battles. But against prepared fortifications, the Mongols had limited options, and Hungary, transformed into a kingdom of castles, negated the Mongols' primary advantages. Fourth, the importance of strategic depth. In 1241, Hungary tried to stop the Mongols at the border with a single large army. When that army was destroyed at Mohi, the kingdom collapsed. In 1285, there was no single point of failure. Every region had its own defenses. Every fortress had its own garrison. Defeating one didn't open the path to defeating the rest. Fifth, the role of leadership vision. Bela IV saw what needed to be done and had the courage to do it, even when it meant overturning centuries of tradition and creating structures that would eventually threaten his own descendants. That's real leadership, not just managing the present, but building for a future you might not live to see. Now, I want to be honest about something. The story isn't as triumphant as it might seem, because Bela's solution to the Mongol threat created new problems that would haunt Hungary for generations. Remember all those castles? By the 1280s, those fortified magnates were essentially independent princes within their own territories. They had their own armies, sometimes as large as the royal army. They had their own revenues. They had strongholds that could defy royal authority indefinitely. The very system that saved Hungary from the Mongols was tearing the kingdom apart from within. The invasion of 1285 highlighted this problem. King Ladislaus IV assembled a royal army, yes, but the real fighting was done by local forces under local commanders. Baron Roland Borsa defeated Nogai's army. The barons drew an obvious conclusion. They didn't need the king to protect them. They could protect themselves. After Ladislaus IV died in 1290 and the Arpad dynasty ended in 1301, Hungary descended into 8 years of brutal civil war as rival magnates fought for the throne. There's a lesson here that applies beyond medieval Hungary. Sometimes the solutions to our most pressing problems create new problems we can't foresee. Bela IV faced an existential threat and responded with radical transformation that saved his kingdom from annihilation. But that transformation fundamentally altered power structures in ways that created new instabilities. Was it worth it? If Bela hadn't implemented his castle-building program, Hungary might have been destroyed in 1285 just as thoroughly as it had been devastated in 1241. So yes, from the perspective of pure survival, the transformation was necessary and successful. But the Hungary that emerged was different. More militarized, more decentralized, more feudal, power more fragmented, authority more contested, unity more fragile. Let me ask you something. What do you think about this trade-off? Let me ask you something. What do you think about this trade-off? Do you think Bela IV made the right choice, even knowing it would eventually weaken royal authority and contribute to future civil wars? Could there have been another way? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear different perspectives on this historical dilemma. But let's talk about the man himself for a moment. Bela IV, because I think his story deserves more attention than it typically gets. When Bela returned to his devastated kingdom in 1242, he was 46 years old. He would live another 28 years. That's 28 years spent rebuilding. 28 years of continuous, exhausting work. Negotiating with nobles, recruiting settlers, overseeing construction projects, reforming administration, managing conflicts. It's not glamorous work. There are no glorious battlefield victories to celebrate. No dramatic moments that make for good paintings. Just decades of grinding, patient effort. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. Bela knew he probably wouldn't live to see the payoff. He was building for the next generation, for his children and grandchildren. He was planting trees under whose shade he would never sit. That takes a special kind of courage. The courage to work toward a goal you might never witness achieved. To sacrifice immediate comfort and security for long-term strategic advantage. Most leaders can't do that. Most leaders optimize for their own reign, their own glory, their own immediate problems. Bela optimized for Hungary's survival 50 years in the future. And when the test came in 1285, 15 years after his death, his vision was vindicated. Let's go back to where we started. Istvan on the walls of Sarospatak fortress in winter 1285, hearing the thunder of Mongol hooves. In 1241, when Istvan's parents heard those hooves, They fled into the wilderness. They hid in caves. They watched their world burn. In 1285, when Istvan heard those hooves, he stood on stone walls 8 feet thick. He was surrounded by trained soldiers with crossbows. He had supplies for a 6-month siege. He had a garrison that knew exactly what Mongol victory looked like and was determined to prevent it. Istvan didn't run. He didn't hide. He rang the warning bell. He took his position on the battlements, and when the Mongols came, when they brought their siege engines and their terror tactics and their legendary ferocity, Istvan and his fellow defenders held. The walls held. Hungary held. That's the real story here. Not just military tactics or castle construction or strategic planning. It's about refusal. The refusal to accept that defeat has to be permanent. The refusal to believe that because something worked once, it will work forever. The refusal to surrender to fear. The Mongols conquered the largest land empire in human history because they were brilliant, disciplined, and ruthless. But they also conquered because most of their enemies, after the first devastating defeat, simply gave up. They accepted that the Mongols were unstoppable, that resistance was futile. Hungary said no. Hungary looked at catastrophic failure and said, that will never happen again. And then they spent 44 years making absolutely certain it wouldn't. That's the lesson that transcends the specifics of medieval warfare. Whether you're talking about military strategy, business competition, personal challenges, or any other arena where failure happens, the response matters more than the failure itself. You can accept defeat as final, or you can study it, learn from it, transform yourself in response to it, and when the challenge comes again, meet it with everything you've learned. The Mongols expected Hungary to be the same, frightened, unprepared kingdom they destroyed in 1241. Instead, they found a kingdom that had transformed itself into their worst nightmare, a kingdom specifically designed to counter everything the Mongols did well. And the Mongols, for all their genius, couldn't adapt fast enough. That's how Hungary crushed the Mongols, not through superior tactics in a single battle, not through military genius or divine intervention, but through strategic patience, long-term vision, and absolute determination never to be caught unprepared again. If you found this story valuable, do me a favor and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Stories like this, about resilience and transformation and long-term thinking, don't get told nearly enough. Let's change that together. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.